History remembers Rome for its legions, its marble, its laws. But buried beneath those triumphs lies a story almost no textbook dares to tell. A story of chambers carved under the Senate where loyalty was manufactured in the dark, and an emperor no one truly elected ruled through vanished voices. Tonight, you'll uncover how a single man weaponized fear with such precision that Rome nearly surrendered its soul without ever realizing it had been stolen. In the turbulent year of 284 AD, when the Roman Empire staggered beneath the weight of mutinous legions and collapsing provinces, few citizens noticed the quiet ascent of Gaius Aelius Varro. He entered history not with the thunder of armies or the spectacle of triumphal processions, but with a series of sudden disappearances that rippled through the upper ranks of imperial administration. Governors resigned overnight. Generals withdrew from public life. Advisors who questioned Varro's decisions were not seen again. Rome, distracted by the constant clamor of border wars, dismissed these vanishings as symptoms of a faltering age. Varro had learned early that power was clearest when exercised out of sight. As a provincial governor in Dalmatia, he discovered that loyalty extracted through fear was more durable than loyalty won through promises. Local rebels vanished under his rule, entire factions dissolving after midnight raids conducted by men who answered only to him. Those methods followed him to Rome, embedded like hidden rot within the state he soon dominated. When the Emperor Numerian died under mysterious circumstances during his eastern campaign, Varro was among the few present. Rumors spread that the young emperor had been murdered long before his corpse was discovered inside the imperial carriage. Varro played the loyal servant, grief-stricken and dutiful, yet in the confusion that followed, he maneuvered skillfully. Within weeks, the Senate, terrified of another military uprising, accepted Varro's claim that he alone could stabilize the empire. Their vote was nearly unanimous. Fear had already started its quiet work. Beneath the Senate chambers, where marble masks of old ancestors gazed eternally downward, Varro oversaw the construction of a new kind of space. It was not a prison in the traditional sense. No chains clinked, no iron bars scraped. Instead, the chamber resembled an administrative vault, disguised behind layered stone that muffled every sound. Only those appointed to Varro's private council knew its true purpose. The first hall measured barely 20 paces long, lit by narrow slits that allowed only slivers of lamplight to enter. It was a place designed not for physical suffering, but for psychological unraveling. Interrogators trained in the eastern provinces, men schooled in manipulating silence, anticipation, and isolation worked with clinical detachment. Their task was not to inflict pain. Their task was to sculpt obedience. Varro visited the chamber often, not as a spectator but as a strategist refining his craft. He understood the human mind with unsettling clarity. Expose a man to violence, and he might resist. Expose him to fear, uncertainty, and deprivation, and he would collapse into pliant submission. Senators who entered the hall emerged altered, quieter, deferential, eager to demonstrate loyalty through public declarations. Rome interpreted their new compliance as unity. Varro knew it was the first proof that his experiment succeeded. By the time whispers reached the streets hinting at something sinister beneath the marble floors, it was already too late. The empire believed it had chosen a steady-handed leader to guide them through chaos. In truth, they had elevated a man who forged his authority in the shadows, using disappearances as stepping stones to absolute control. Rome did not yet understand who Varro truly was, but Varro understood Rome perfectly. Marcius Selim never intended to become a servant of imperial terror. Born in the outskirts of Antioch, he earned his reputation designing siege mechanisms that combined elegance with ruthless efficiency. Roman generals admired his clarity of mind. Eastern scholars praised his philosophy of silent force, a principle rooted in controlling an opponent without ever striking. Selim viewed engineering as the study of pressure, how a single shift in weight, temperature, or sound could determine victory. That philosophy would later be twisted into something far darker. When Varro summoned him to Rome, Selim assumed it concerned fortifications along the Danube frontier. Instead, he found himself escorted not to a military forum, but to the substructure beneath the Senate. There, the newly crowned emperor led him through narrow corridors still smelling of dust and fresh limestone. Varro spoke calmly, almost academically, describing his vision for a space that would compel obedience without leaving scars. His certainty unsettled Selim more than any overt threat could have. Selim protested at first, arguing that his talents were intended for the battlefield, not for the manipulation of Rome's own elite. Varro listened with patient interest before revealing that Selim's family remained in Antioch under the watch of imperial officers. Their safety, Varro explained, depended entirely on Selim's cooperation. The engineer understood then that refusal was no longer an option. His hands, renowned for crafting engines of war, were now bound to a purpose he despised. Varro's requests were unsettlingly precise. He wanted chambers that could disorient a man within hours, devices capable of amplifying silence until it felt like suffocation, and spaces where a prisoner could not tell whether moments or days had passed. Selim studied Roman stonework, acoustics, and thermal patterns, converting them into tools of psychological dismantling. His designs avoided visible brutality. Instead, they manipulated the senses, warping perception until resistance decayed into fragile compliance. The first device he created resembled an innocuous metal frame, its surfaces smooth and unassuming. Yet when activated, it produced a faint oscillation within the stone floor, so subtle it seemed imagined, but persistent enough to unravel coherent thought. Another mechanism controlled drafts of cold air directed precisely at a prisoner's neck, creating the sensation of a presence always standing behind them. Varro was delighted. These were instruments that left no wounds, only fractures in certainty. As construction expanded, Selim attempted to conceal small flaws within his designs, subtle misalignments that might neutralize their effects. But Varro employed overseers skilled in detecting sabotage. Each flaw was found, corrected, and reported. Selim's margin for defiance shrank until he realized that any attempt to undermine the work would cost his family their lives. He continued, therefore, but with a growing horror at how quickly his sketches became instruments of fear. The Senate remained ignorant of the engineer's role, unaware that beneath their debates lay corridors shaped by Selim's reluctant brilliance. Rumors circulated among workers who transported materials overnight, whispering that the emperor sought to build a new kind of power, one forged not from armies but from terrors no eye could witness. Selim moved through these spaces with the gait of a man haunted by his own craftsmanship. What tormented him most was Varro's calm conviction. The emperor believed Rome must be reshaped through invisible pressure, its leaders guided not by honor but by engineered dread. Selim, trapped within his own designs, recognized that he had become the architect of the very machinery that would devour the empire from within. In the months following the completion of Selim's early chambers, Rome entered a period of deceptive calm. The markets bustled, magistrates performed their rituals, and the Senate continued its endless debates. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm, an invisible erosion was underway. Political dissenters, once vocal critics of imperial overreach, began vanishing with alarming regularity. They disappeared not during public clashes or political trials, but in the quietest hours before dawn, taken from homes without a single shouted accusation. At first, these removals were attributed to criminal disputes or the retribution of rival factions. But as the list of missing names grew, senators whispered more cautiously, weighing each word before speaking. They feared that the wrong phrase, the wrong inflection, might summon the emperor's shadowed enforcers. Rumors described them as ghosts in imperial armor, men who moved without torchlight, spoke only in gestures, and answered solely to Varro's private counsel. What distinguished Varro's purge from earlier persecutions was its meticulous silence. No proclamation announced charges. No public trials justified the arrests. Families who attempted to petition for answers discovered their letters intercepted long before approaching the emperor's attention. Some were returned in fragments, others vanished entirely. A few desperate relatives tried appealing directly to the Praetorian prefect, only to be informed that no such prisoners existed within state custody. According to official records, the missing had never been taken. Behind those doctored records lay the chamber network, expanding like a hidden root system beneath Rome. Varro's interrogators used the new methods perfected by Selim's designs. Prisoners were led through a maze of narrow corridors, each turn muffling sound further until even their breathing seemed swallowed. Some chambers imposed total darkness, trapping the mind in a void where time lost its shape. Others hummed with faint vibrations that confused perception, creating the illusion of distant footsteps or whispered accusations. Prisoners were not beaten. They were dismantled slowly, urged to renounce supposed conspiracies crafted by Varro's scribes. The purpose was not punishment, but transformation. Those who survived emerged subdued, their spirits hollowed, their loyalties pliant. Some were reinstated to their positions with renewed obedience. Others were quietly exiled, deemed too fragile to return to public life. None dared reveal what they had endured. The Senate, sensing the invisible pressure tightening around them, grew increasingly compliant. Votes that once required days of heated argument now passed with eerie unanimity. No senator wanted to be the lone voice of dissent. In taverns, patrons lowered their voices when discussing politics, unsure whether the man at the next table might be an informant. Rome's famed public forums, once vibrant arenas of debate, shifted toward rehearsed praises of imperial stability. A few brave families attempted organized appeals, drafting collective petitions and pledging to present them directly to Varro during public ceremonies. But these efforts, too, never reached their destination. The emperor's loyal guards intercepted signatories one by one, ensuring no gathering ever grew large enough to pose a threat. Some families later received unsigned notes advising them to relinquish their inquiries. Most obeyed. Only those closest to the imperial palace knew how deep the fear ran. Varro's council monitored correspondence, controlled travel permissions, and tracked even minor grievances. To the public, Rome appeared stable under the emperor's steady hand. But beneath the marble facades and sunlit plazas, the chambers had become the empire's true judiciary cold spaces where guilt was invented and obedience forged. The streets of Rome bustled with life, but the voices meant to warn the city never reached them. Senator Quintus Livius Marcellus had once stood beside Varro as both ally and advocate, praising the emperor's early reforms and urging others to grant him the authority needed to stabilize the empire. Marcellus believed Rome required firm leadership, not unchecked dominance, and he trusted Varro at first. But as disappearances mounted and whispers crept through the Senate halls, Marcellus began to grasp the truth that others feared to utter. Varro was not consolidating Rome, he was binding it in chains fashioned from silence. The breaking point came when Varro introduced a decree granting himself complete immunity for any action taken in the interest of state security. If passed, it would elevate the emperor above every law, shield him from all accountability, and eliminate even symbolic restraints. Most senators saw the decree as a test of obedience. Many had already felt the unseen pressure of the chambers beneath their feet and dared not oppose it. Marcellus, however, refused to bow. He stood before the Senate, voice steady, declaring that Rome had survived centuries of chaos precisely because no man was permitted absolute power. The chamber grew deathly quiet. Senators shifted in their seats, avoiding Varro's gaze. Marcellus understood, even as he spoke, that he had crossed a boundary from which none returned. Yet he continued, naming the growing culture of fear, questioning the disappearances, and demanding transparency. His words fell like stones into water, heard, felt, and feared. That evening, Varro's guards arrived at his home. No charges were read, no witnesses were permitted. Marcellus was escorted through the familiar marble corridors, but instead of entering the Senate's upper chambers, he was led downward into the cold substructure known only to a select few. The descent was long, each step sinking him deeper into a world engineered for unraveling human resolve. For 9 days, Marcellus endured a form of torment that left no bruises, yet shredded the barriers of the mind. The interrogators kept him awake with alternating bursts of light and suffocating darkness. At irregular intervals, faint vibrations pulsed through the stone floor, creating the illusion of approaching footsteps. Cold drafts brushed his neck as if someone breathed behind him. He was given water but almost no food, each sip a reminder that his well-being depended entirely on the whims of men who spoke in quiet, measured tones. They accused him of conspiracies he knew were fabricated, plots, hidden alliances, secret pacts with provincial governors. When he denied them, they did not strike him. They merely increased the silence, stretching it until his thoughts rang louder than the chamber itself. Sleep deprivation gnawed at his composure. On the 4th night, Marcellus began hearing voices that were not there. By the 6th, he questioned whether time still followed any reasonable order. On the 9th day, trembling, disoriented, and unable to distinguish reality from manipulation, Marcellus broke. He confessed to everything placed before him, not because he believed it, but because he could no longer endure the void pressing against his sanity. His forced confession was transcribed meticulously, each false detail marked for future use. Varro would later reference Marcellus's admission as evidence of internal treachery, solidifying support for harsher security measures. Marcellus's collapse became the blueprint. Interrogators studied his progression as physicians study an illness, analyzing which combinations of deprivation produced the fastest surrender. Varro praised the efficiency, declaring that Rome had discovered a new way to shape loyalty. Above ground, senators noticed Marcellus's absence, but none asked where he had gone. By the 3rd year of Varro's rule, the chamber network had outgrown the discreet vaults beneath the Senate. He required more space, more isolation, and a location where screams, if they ever escaped, would dissolve harmlessly into the city's natural noise. Disused structures scattered throughout Rome became targets for conversion, but none offered greater potential than the aging baths of Caracalla. The complex's massive furnaces, echoing pipes, and sprawling sublevels created a natural shroud, a place where terror could hide beneath the ordinary rhythms of public leisure. Citizens visited daily, unknowingly stepping above corridors that would soon reshape the empire's darkest truths. Engineers surveyed the lowest levels, where heat from the hypocaust systems pulsed endlessly through stone channels. Unlike the chambers beneath the Senate, which relied primarily on engineered silence, these new rooms would use distortion itself as the instrument of torment. Steam hissed at unpredictable intervals, each burst ricocheting through corridors like a whispering presence. Dripping water formed irregular rhythms that echoed through the pipework, shifting tone just when a captive began to adapt. The ever-present warmth weakened the body in ways that could not be easily resisted. It blurred the line between exhaustion and hallucination, between reality and fear. Workers assigned to the renovations rarely understood the project's true nature. Many believed they were restoring the ancient foundations, reinforcing the structure against collapse. The presence of Varro's silent guards discouraged questions, and those who noticed inconsistencies quickly chose discretion. At night, prisoners were ushered in through service corridors that normally accommodated fuel deliveries. Few realized they had been taken to a public sanctuary rather than a hidden fortress. Above them, bathers floated in warm pools, praising the emperor for preserving such luxury during troubled times. Their laughter traveled faintly downward, reaching the ears of captives who mistook it for the voices of ghosts drifting just beyond sight. Life within the bathhouse chambers lacked any sense of rhythm. The heat made rest slippery and shallow, while the pressure of the environment corroded the will with relentless subtlety. Guards manipulated vents to release sudden blasts of cold, followed by suffocating waves of warmth. No pattern emerged, leaving prisoners unable to predict the next shift. Interrogators intervened only when necessary, guiding captives toward confessions with minimal instruction. Many surrendered their resistance before formal questioning even began, believing the chamber itself was an enemy designed to consume their strength. Those who clung to defiance often found their own breathing distorted by the acoustics, forming phantom whispers that seemed to accuse them of imagined crimes. Rumors spread among furnace workers who labored closest to the lower passages. They whispered of vibrations at night, strange pulses that made tools tremble in their hands. A few claimed they heard faint cries rising through heated floors. Supervisors dismissed the tales as heat-induced illusions, warning that spreading such nonsense risked charges of sedition. Yet the rumors slipped into markets, taverns, and aqueduct routes. Citizens tried to ignore them, insisting the baths were symbols of Rome's endurance, not gateways to suffering. But as the whispers persisted, so too did the realization that the empire's comfort and cruelty were now separated by nothing more than layers of stone. Above, Rome bathed in warmth and luxury. Below, Rome unraveled in heat and shadow. Lucius Arvinius had once been celebrated as a model of Roman virtue, a decorated centurion whose loyalty to the empire had never faltered. He fought in distant provinces, endured brutal winters along the Danube, and survived skirmishes that claimed men far stronger than himself. When Varro rose to power, Arvinius believed Rome finally had a leader capable of restoring order. His commitment to service made him an ideal recruit for the emperor's private interrogation corps. He accepted the assignment without hesitation, unaware that the task would corrode the very foundation of his identity. At first, Arvinius viewed the chambers as necessary tools, unpleasant but justified by the empire's fragile state. He had witnessed rebellions flourish from unchecked dissent. He understood the danger of powerful men working against the state. But the chambers beneath the Senate and the bathhouse were not instruments of justice. They were mechanisms of psychological dissection. Arvinius learned to operate Selim's devices, adjusting the oscillating floors, manipulating airflow, and coordinating sensory deprivation sessions. He followed instructions with soldierly precision, yet each confession he extracted felt less like safeguarding Rome and more like extinguishing a piece of another human being. The turning point came with the interrogation of a young scribe accused of smuggling letters critical of Varro. The boy, barely old enough to shave, insisted he had only copied messages for his master. Arvinius tried to maintain detachment, but as the chamber's engineered silence pressed upon the trembling youth, something in the centurion cracked. When the boy finally broke, confessing to conspiracies he had never heard of, Arvinius felt no triumph. He felt only nausea. That night, he washed his hands again and again, unable to rid himself of an intangible residue. Over time, guilt seeped into his sleep. He dreamed of the chambers, even when awake, dark corridors that seemed to coil around him like living things. The faint vibrations Selim had designed for prisoners now echoed in Arvinius's skull without cause. He began avoiding his colleagues, haunted by the realization that he had become a weapon in Varro's arsenal of fear. He wrote a letter to an old comrade stationed in Pannonia, hinting at his desire to leave Rome. The letter never reached its destination. Varro's spies intercepted it within hours. The emperor summoned Arvinius privately, speaking with the same cold civility he used on senators. He praised the centurion's service, then asked a single devastating question: why does a loyal servant contemplate abandoning his post? Arvinius could not answer. Varro did not need one. In his eyes, hesitation equaled betrayal. A man who wished to flee the chambers could no longer be trusted to guard their secrets. Arvinius was taken not to his quarters but downward past corridors he once walked with authority, now stripped of their familiarity. Interrogators he had trained with avoided his gaze. For the first time, he felt the terror he had inflicted on others. They placed him inside a chamber of his own devising, calibrating the mechanisms exactly as he had instructed them so many times before. The silence descended first, then the faint tremors, then the calculated shifts in temperature meant to unravel the mind. There was no interrogation, no accusation. Varro required no confession from him. He required an example. Arvinius's screams never reached the surface. But the message did. Even Rome's tormentors were disposable. The first rumors of the ledger surfaced in Antioch like a tremor beneath the political earth, subtle, uncertain, but impossible to ignore. Merchants whispering in the colonnade spoke of a document carried secretly through the eastern provinces, a book containing names Rome had quietly erased. At first, these tales were dismissed as provincial agitation. But then fragments appeared in the hands of a retired magistrate who recognized several entries and went pale. This was no rumor. It was a record. The ledger itself was small enough to fit beneath a cloak bound in unmarked leather, but its contents were vast. Within its pages lay the names of hundreds processed through Varro's chambers over the past 3 years. Senators, scribes, merchants, generals, priestesses, grain inspectors, scribes' apprentices, even children of minor noble houses. Each name was followed by a series of coded symbols indicating method, duration, outcome, and subsequent placement. Some were released. Many vanished permanently. All had been deemed politically relevant, a phrase written repeatedly in the margins by a careful, bureaucratic hand. The discovery stunned Antioch's officials. Rome had always been ruthless toward threats, but the ledger revealed something far more disturbing. Varro's selections were not guided by stability or security. They were driven by paranoia, personal vendettas disguised as state necessity, disputes over land, casual criticisms, old rivalries from Varro's days as governor, even private disagreements with imperial officers had resulted in families being torn apart in the night. The chambers were not Rome's shield, they were Varro's mirror of fear. The magistrate who first examined the ledger met privately with 3 provincial governors. They pored over its contents in a locked storeroom, speaking in hushed tones as though the very walls might betray them. Names they knew, colleagues, allies, rivals, were listed with chilling precision. Even more unsettling were entries marked with a discrete symbol indicating preventative evaluation, meaning individuals taken not for crimes but for potential disloyalty. The governors understood the implication. Varro's reach extended beyond action into thought itself. Whispers of revolt circulated in Antioch's administrative circles. Some argued that Varro's tyranny had breached the limits Rome could endure, that the legions must be rallied to challenge him. Others warned that the emperor's network of informants was too extensive, that any misstep would result in entire provinces being labeled traitors. The fear of the chambers, now fully exposed, became its own weapon. Even the mere idea of being added to the ledger froze dissent before it could solidify. News of the discovery leaked slowly, carried by merchants traveling westward, murmured in caravans, passed between soldiers stationed along dusty roads. Each retelling grew more vivid. Some claimed the ledger contained thousands of names. Others insisted it described torture so refined it left no trace. Accuracy mattered little. What mattered was that the myth of Varro's infallible justice had shattered. The empire understood, at last, that the emperor's shadow fell on anyone who crossed his path. Varro received word of the ledger's appearance within days. His response was immediate and merciless. Couriers were dispatched to Antioch with sealed orders. Officials connected to the leak were quietly removed. Records were burned. Witnesses vanished. The emperor intended to erase not just the ledger, but the possibility of its truth. But he could not erase the fear it unleashed. The governors who had seen the ledger understood what awaited them if they remained passive, yet none dared act, not while Varro's chambers still breathed beneath Rome. The winter that year descended upon Rome like an iron shroud, gray, breathless, and heavy with a cold that seemed to seep straight from the marble foundations of the Palatine Hill. Senators wrapped themselves in wool cloaks as they entered the winter courts, expecting another season of tedious debates over grain shipments and frontier taxes. Instead, they stepped into the most fear-soaked session the empire had witnessed since the days of Caligula. Varro presided from an elevated dais, draped in crimson, his expression unreadable. Behind him stood a formation of praetorians whose armor gleamed unnervingly under torchlight. The air was tense, as if every man present sensed the hidden trap but could not locate it. Varro opened the court, not with policy but with accusations, grand, sweeping claims of treason that rippled across the hall like a sudden storm. He named entire factions of the Senate, reformists, conservative statesmen, even long-standing allies who had served Rome for decades. He claimed they had conspired to weaken imperial authority, collaborated with foreign envoys, and destabilized the treasury. The evidence he presented was fragmented and absurd. Anonymous letters, misinterpreted comments, minor disagreements inflated into plots. Yet everyone knew the truth. This purge had little to do with loyalty. Varro was cleansing Rome of anyone capable of opposing him. The senators erupted in protests, but the chamber guards responded instantly. They surged forward, seizing the first wave of those named. Cloaks tore, scrolls scattered, and the echo of armored boots filled the hall. Some senators attempted to flee, but hidden corridors were already blocked. Over 40 were captured within the hour, bound in chains and marched through a concealed passage beneath the floor, a route so secret that only the emperor's private guard had access. The hidden passage descended into a complex of tunnels beneath the Palatine Hill. For many, it was the first and last time they would see the world above. The chambers awaited them like open jaws. Some senators, accustomed to a lifetime of privilege, surrendered mentally the moment they saw the cold stone walls. Others resisted fiercely, screaming their innocence until the doors sealed. Their interrogations lasted weeks. The winter courts above continued as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Empty seats were explained away as temporary detainments. Rome's citizens whispered, speculating about the vanished senators, but fear devoured curiosity. Only a handful knew the horrors unfolding beneath the hill. Within the chambers, Varro demanded confessions tailored to justify his expanding authority. Interrogators manipulated temperature, light, sound tools designed not to wound the body but to unravel the mind. Senators who once lectured on law and virtue now begged for mercy, clawed at walls, recited invented conspiracies simply to make the silence stop. A few died before breaking. Most survived long enough to sign statements validating Varro's claims. When the confessions were finally unveiled, Varro framed them as proof that Rome had been moments away from collapse. He declared new emergency powers, dissolved several political blocs, and restructured the Senate to ensure absolute compliance. The empire's political structure, once cumbersome, flawed yet resilient, buckled beneath institutionalized terror. Rome no longer had a Senate. It had spectators. Above ground, citizens noticed the change in atmosphere. Senators rarely spoke publicly, provincial envoys refused to linger in Rome, and the imperial guard patrolled with unchecked confidence. The winter courts had achieved their purpose. Varro ruled alone, but even as he tightened his grip, challenges were already forming, unseen and quiet, waiting for their moment. Aelius Varro grew up believing her father was the architect of Rome's stability, the stern but righteous guardian who kept the empire from collapsing under its own weight. She lived in a world of tutors, marble gardens, and carefully curated stories, each designed to portray Varro as a man burdened by duty, not corrupted by power. But even the most fortified illusions can fracture under the pressure of truth. It began on an evening when the palace corridors flickered with torchlight and a group of praetorians marched past Aelia's chamber. Their boots struck the stone with an urgency she had never heard before. Curiosity tugged at her, stronger than caution. She followed at a distance, silent as a shadow, weaving through servants' passages as she trailed the guards deeper into the restricted wing. The air grew colder the farther she went, until the warmth of the palace seemed like a distant memory. She had been forbidden from this part of the complex since childhood, told it contained military archives and strategic records too sensitive for public eyes. But the path the guards took spiraled downward, beyond any archive she had ever seen mapped. They stopped before a reinforced bronze door. One guard knocked twice, paused, then knocked again. The pattern echoed like a secret heartbeat. The door opened, and Aelia slipped inside at the last possible moment, unseen in the wake of the armored figures. What she witnessed shattered the world she knew. The chamber was vast, dimly lit by braziers that cast violent shadows on the walls. Senators, merchants, and soldiers, people she recognized from imperial banquets, were chained to stone pillars, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness. Interrogators spoke in calm, almost methodical tones as they adjusted devices that hummed, dripped, or scraped. None of the instruments were designed for spectacle. They were meant for silence, for slow fracturing of identity. Aelia's breath froze in her throat. She had heard rumors whispered by dissenters, stories of Varro's chambers used to extract confessions, but she had dismissed them as propaganda. Now the truth consumed her like fire. She watched a senator plead that he had served Rome faithfully for 30 years. The interrogator didn't respond. He simply shifted a lever that filled the room with a low metallic resonance, a sound that seemed to crawl under the man's skin. The senator's words dissolved into panicked sobbing. Aelia stumbled backward, her heart pounding, her mind spiraling. The chamber was not a place of justice. It was a machine built, refined, perfected by her father. That night, she returned to her quarters shaking. Sleep refused to come. Her mind replayed what she had seen, mixing with memories of her father reading to her, laughing with her, blessing her forehead before ceremonies. She felt torn between two worlds, the daughter raised in warmth, and the witness forced into cold reality. In the days that followed, she began recording everything. She wrote down dates, times, names of the prisoners she recognized, descriptions of methods, even the layout of the hidden corridors. Every detail mattered. She hid her notes in hollowed-out scrolls, in seams of her clothing, in the false bottom of her writing desk. When she completed her first detailed account, she risked everything by sending it north to General Decimus Flavianus, a man she knew despised Varro's growing power, but had always remained silent. Her message was simple. You were right. I have seen it. Rome needs you. With that act, Aelia became the first crack in Varro's empire of fear. General Decimus Flavianus received Aelia Varro's hidden documents on a night when the Danube winds howled against the fortress walls. He read them alone by lamplight, his jaw tightening as he examined every detail. The names of the disappeared, the chamber descriptions, the forged confessions, and the chilling notes written in Aelia's trembling hand. By dawn, he knew Rome was no longer governed by law, but by a man consumed by fear and delusion. And if no one intervened, the entire empire would rot from within. Publicly, Flavianus requested authorization to reinforce the northern borders against rumored barbarian movements. Varro approved the request immediately, mistaking it for loyalty. He had no idea that the same legions he permitted to march southward were carrying evidence prepared by his own daughter, evidence strong enough to ignite an empire-wide reckoning. The march began under the guise of routine mobilization. 20,000 soldiers advanced in disciplined formation, shields strapped, standards raised. Yet beneath their calm exterior, word spread through the ranks. The emperor had lost his honor, and Rome had become a prison for its own people. The men marched not for borders, but for liberation. As the legions approached the outskirts of the capital, Varro sensed something was wrong. Scouts reported that the army's route did not align with northern reinforcement paths. Varro summoned his praetorian prefects and demanded an immediate defensive mobilization. Fear sharpened every order he gave. He stationed elite units at the city gates, the Palatine Hill, and, most heavily, the chambers themselves. But fear cannot match conviction. The legions reached the northern gates at dawn. Their arrival was so sudden that the guards barely had time to raise the alarm before the first clash erupted. Steel rang against steel, arrows streaked across the early light, and the gates of Rome trembled under the weight of advancing shields. Flavianus's soldiers fought not with desperation, but with purpose. The Praetorians fought with the terror of men who knew failure meant facing the same chambers they once protected. The battle spilled into the outer districts. Citizens fled into their homes as the streets became battlegrounds. Fires ignited from shattered oil lamps, sending black smoke upward like dark omens. By midday, Varro's Praetorians had fallen back to defensive lines around the Palatine Hill. Their faces were pale, hollow-eyed. They had been loyal for years, but even loyalty has limits when commanded by paranoia. Flavianus pushed forward methodically. He forbade his men from harming civilians and ensured captured Praetorians received fair treatment. Unlike Varro, he understood that Rome needed restoration, not revenge. His leadership strengthened morale. His fairness drew some Praetorians to defect. That evening, Varro attempted to send envoys for negotiation, but none reached their destination. Rumors swirled that the emperor was preparing an escape route, yet Varro remained trapped by the very fortress he built. The city that once bowed to him now trembled beneath the weight of rebellion. At nightfall, the final assault began. Legionaries stormed the Palatine Hill, breaching walls and forcing Praetorians into desperate final stands. The clash of iron reverberated through Rome, echoing into the chambers below ground where so many had suffered. By the next morning, the legions controlled nearly the entire capital. Only the Senate House and the chambers beneath it remained under Varro's grasp. Flavianus knew the end was close, and Varro finally understood that fear could no longer protect him. When dawn broke over Rome, its light revealed the scars of a city that had finally turned against its master. Smoke drifted from collapsed archways, shields lay abandoned in gutters, and citizen whispers rustled through the streets like a long-suppressed truth emerging from darkness. The Danube legions held every critical point of the capital. Only two places remained untouched: the Senate House and the hidden chambers carved beneath its ancient foundations. Aelia Varro stood with General Flavianus on the steps of the Curia, knowing that her father was somewhere below, locked in the maze he had once commanded with absolute certainty. Varro's attempts to flee had failed. His escape routes, tunnels that once carried whimpering captives into secrecy, were sealed or collapsed from the fighting. The emperor had barricaded himself deep within the underground complex. He had ordered flames set to several corridors, destroying documents, tools, restraints, and any traces that could condemn him. Smoke seeped through stone cracks. The chambers groaned like a dying creature. Flavianus sent detachments to extinguish the fires before they consumed the entire hill. The soldiers moved through the labyrinth carefully, stepping over charred timbers and smoldering fragments of ledgers. They passed rooms where the walls were blackened with soot and ceilings sagged from heat. The infamous devices, once so meticulously engineered by Selim, now lay twisted, melted, or shattered. It was as if Varro hoped that by erasing the instruments, he could erase the sins attached to them. But evidence endured even when metal did not, so did memory. 2 hours into the descent, a scout reported hearing movement from the deepest corridor. Flavianus descended with Aelia and a small detachment, their torches illuminating the narrow stone walls. A faint smell of burning papyrus lingered in the air. As they approached the final chamber, the oldest one, the one Varro had built first, shadows flickered like restless spirits. They found Varro alone, standing in the center of the chamber, staring at the scorched remnants of his earliest ledgers. He looked more spectral than imperial. His once proud posture had collapsed into a stoop, his robe stained with soot and sweat. His hands trembled as he clutched a broken lamp, as if he had run out of things to destroy and was now trying to shatter light itself. He did not react when Flavianus entered. Instead, he whispered to the darkness around him, as though speaking to the ghosts of the hundreds he had dragged here. His voice quivered with disbelief. They were threats, all of them. Rome needed order. I kept it safe. Aelia stepped forward, her expression torn between grief and resolve. Her voice was steady when she spoke. You kept Rome afraid. You ruled shadows, not people. The words struck him harder than any blade. Varro finally looked up, and for the first time, his eyes reflected the terror he had inflicted on others. He recognized his daughter, not as an ally, but as the architect of his downfall. His lips parted as if to plead, to justify, or to command, but no sound escaped. Silence enveloped him, cruelly fitting for a man who once weaponized it. Flavianus ordered no chains. Varro did not resist when soldiers approached. They guided him to the same interrogation seat he had forced countless others into, not as a prisoner to be broken, but as a ruler to be confronted. Aelia read aloud from the surviving fragments of his forbidden ledger. Every name, every child, elder, soldier, senator. With each word, Varro's face crumpled further, until he no longer resembled an emperor but a hollow man collapsing beneath the truth. The chamber did not break him. His own legacy did. By evening, Rome knew the chamber king had fallen. The fall of Gaius Aelius Varro did not end with a triumphant procession or the clang of victory horns. Rome met the conclusion of its darkest chapter with a heavy, uneasy silence. The city had survived battles before, but the wounds carved by fear, secrecy, and betrayal were deeper than any sword could cut. When Varro was brought from beneath the Senate house, escorted by legionaries and his own trembling steps, the people did not cheer. They simply watched, hollow-eyed, as a man who once commanded the empire now struggled to command his own mind. Flavianus ordered he be taken to a secure holding room above ground, far from the chambers he had set ablaze. But Varro's body and thoughts were already unraveling. He muttered incoherently, repeating fragments of old decrees, half-finished orders, and the names of men long dead. Every few moments he paused, as if listening to echoes only he could hear. Perhaps he did. The chambers had been built to break the minds of others. Now they consumed the architect himself. Aelia Varro remained close, though she could not bring herself to speak to him again. Her betrayal had saved Rome, but it had also severed the last thread connecting her to the father she once admired. She watched as physicians examined him and shook their heads, whispering that no illness, poison, or injury explained his condition. His collapse was not physical. It was the final collapse of a conscience denied for too long. By sunset, Varro had stopped speaking entirely. His gaze shifted from wall to wall, as though trapped in invisible confines. When the lamps were lit, he flinched at their glow. When the room fell quiet, he trembled like a child abandoned in the dark. No interrogator touched him. No device harmed him. The silence alone completed what rebellion and fire had begun. In the final hour of his life, Aelia approached him, not as a daughter seeking forgiveness, nor as a witness awaiting confession, but as a historian determined to understand the monster Rome nearly became. Varro met her eyes for a fleeting moment. Something flickered there. Recognition, sorrow, or the last glimmer of a man buried beneath layers of fear. Then his breath caught, shallow and uneven. He leaned back, trembling, and exhaled once more, softly, like a sigh swallowed by the depths. Gaius Aelius Varro was gone. Flavianus ordered that no monument be erected, no honorific inscription carved. His burial was simple, unmarked, and silent. Rome's shame would not be lionized in marble. Instead, the Senate, now restored, motioned to seal every chamber Varro had ever commissioned. Stonemasons worked day and night, entombing corridors where countless souls had suffered. They said that sealing the chambers would bury the trauma with them, but Aelia knew better. She began gathering testimonies from survivors, merchants who vanished on their way to vote, soldiers dragged from barracks without explanation, wives who spent years searching for men already dead beneath Rome's marble floors. She recorded details with uncompromising clarity, the mechanisms, the methods, the manipulations of fear. Her goal was not vengeance, but preservation. A civilization that forgot its darkness would surely repeat it. Years later, scholars would reference her writings as the most important documentation of internal tyranny in Roman history. Generations of students would read of Varro's rise, his chambers, and the terror that replaced law. And though Rome continued, standing proudly as empires do, it carried a scar invisible but undeniable, a reminder of the cruelty that once hid beneath its marble floors and the silence that nearly devoured a civilization.